One of the ways that I try to figure out if I'm an optimist or a pessimist about something is to look at as much evidence as I can find and look at trends. So that's what I want to do here in the form that's hopefully familiar to a lot of folk in this audience, a FAQ on what's going on with technology, jobs, and wages. So first question, what's going on? Second one, complicated phenomenon. Here's an overly simple answer. My answers are all going to be simplifications, hopefully not deeply wrong oversimplifications. So what's going on is the polarization or the hollowing out of the workforce in America and most of the rich countries in the world. This was a phenomenon really nicely documented by our MIT colleague David Otter, who Eric mentioned earlier today. Let me show you a representation that David drew. That's my favorite picture about what's been happening to the American workforce over the past couple generations. And what David did was take all the jobs that existed in America in 1979, and he lined them up from lowest paid to highest paid. And then what he wanted to do was look at future time periods and see how the jobs moved around. Not in absolute numbers, but in market share. Were we creating proportionally more well-paid jobs or proportionally more less well-paid jobs? And what he found was from 1979 to 1989, this is what happened. The red line is no change in share. So if you're below that red line, these were the kinds of jobs that lost market share over that time period. Everything above the red line gained market share of jobs over that period. So even though it doesn't quite look like this on the graph, the area below the red line is always equal to the area above the red line. And what you see is a really happy phenomenon from 1979 to 1989. Most of the jobs we were creating were right there, 40th, 50th percentile and above. We were creating middle class, upper class jobs in America. We were proportionally losing share down at the bottom half of the wage distribution. This is fantastic. Watch that bulge of the jobs where we lost share. Watch what happens to that bulge as we move forward in time, because there's one pretty clear trend. That bulge starts to move in one direction. The job of share being lost starts to go upward in the wage scale. So from 89 to 99, we created a bunch of fairly lousy jobs. Look at that job creation down low. Some middle class, the upper middle class is doing pretty well. Things got weird between 99 and 2000. Basically, the only jobs we were creating were lower middle class and lower class jobs. And that job loss was pretty widely distributed, and no one was doing all that well. In the most recent years for which we have data, that phenomenon is accentuating. The only thing that's changing is that the 80th percentile and above is doing pretty well. This corresponds to the data that Jeff just showed on what's been happening to the top 10% of the wage distribution. So I love this representation. It's this very clear picture of what's been happening to the U.S. workforce over time. Lots of things have been happening to the U.S. workforce over time. This is my favorite and most clear picture about what's been going on. So we got this barbell-shaped economy where there are gains up top and gains down in fairly lousy, low-paid, primarily service sector jobs, and the classic American middle class has been getting hollowed out. Is this a U.S.-only phenomenon? Absolutely not. Here's a pretty nice graph about 16 European countries, a different way to show the same phenomenon. 3 bars for each country, least paid jobs, middle paid jobs, high paid jobs. The phenomenon is entirely consistent in every one of these countries. The job loss has happened right there in the middle. We hear a lot about why this is going on. Is this mainly because we're exporting all these great manufacturing jobs to China? Absolutely not. We are exporting manufacturing jobs to China, and that's responsible for something. But let me show you what I think is a really elegant refutation of this argument. No. It's a picture of U.S. manufacturing value added. What gets lost in the debate very often, the U.S. is a manufacturing powerhouse. China recently took over the #1 position. We are the #2 manufacturing country in the world. Our manufacturing output is greater than that of Germany, France, Italy, and India combined. It's been going up pretty steadily every non-recession year. We keep turning out more stuff. We keep turning out more stuff with fewer and fewer workers over time. So the red line there is the total U.S. employment in manufacturing. That peaked in 1979 and has been heading down with a couple, ebbs and flows, but heading down fairly steadily ever since. This is purely a productivity story. This is purely an automation story. It is not a globalization story. So what is the cause? What's going on here? Again, to oversimplify, hopefully not too much, The phenomenon that's been going on is the large-scale automation of routine work. What we need to keep in mind is that the American middle class, this large, stable, prosperous middle class, was built on the back of routine work. The 50th percentile American worker does not have a college education, has never had a college education. This is lower than college educated, routine physical work. Think about an employee on an assembly line, and routine cognitive work. Think about the payroll clerk in that same factory. And Otter has done a bunch of work on this. Let me put up his conclusions. He's not a technology scholar primarily, so when he says stuff like this, I take it pretty seriously. He says, look, what technology is really good at is substituting for routine, repetitive work, both cognitive and physical. His work is beautiful, it's really thorough, and he says, look, we've taken into account low-skilled immigration. We've taken into account globalization. We've taken into account these other explanations. They are not central to the phenomenon, to the finding that's going on here. So the American middle class is getting hollowed out, and it is the technology that's the main driver of that. Okay, well, why isn't there mass technological unemployment? This was what Keynes was predicting in 1930. We don't have mass unemployment. The U.S. unemployment rate is about 4.7%. The unemployment rate's about 4.7%, and has been below 5 for coming on a year now. So what is going on? There is a combination of things that explain this. Number one is good old-fashioned economic growth. There's nothing that creates jobs like a growing economy, combined with flexibility and mobility in the labor force. Unfortunately, the kind of mobility we've been seeing is downward mobility. So to underscore that point about the central importance of just economic growth, the top line there is U.S. GDP per capita, that's growth, and then the red line there is how many jobs there are in the country. These two have this incredibly tightly coupled relationship. The reason the gap between those two is growing is just plain old productivity. We have an incredibly flexible workforce. This is an OECD ranking of different measures of workforce flexibility. The OECD is the rich countries club. We have probably the most flexible workforce across the OECD. So when situations change, our labor force can reallocate itself more quickly than other places. Other countries have a higher official unemployment problem than we do, in part because they don't have as mobile a workforce. But the problem is the mobility has been primarily downward. Again, to redraw the picture, we're hollowing out right here, and we're creating right there. The mobility is primarily going down. What that means is if you draw one more line on that graph, this is what it looks like. So that bottom line there, the one that's flatlining, is 50th percentile median American household income. That flatlined about the turn of the century, and we really haven't made up virtually any ground since then. So to add a little bit to this, there actually is mass unemployment. I want to underscore something Moshe said earlier. There is a community in the States that is experiencing European-style levels of unemployment, and it's exactly prime-age American men. This is what's been happening to their labor force participation. And labor force participation means you either have a job or you're actively looking for one. So these days, about 12% of prime-age U.S. men are not employed and they're not looking for work. They're deliberately sitting on the sidelines of the economy. Like you can imagine, this is pretty tightly concentrated among the least educated American men. So the participation rate among people with at least a college education is declining pretty slightly. Look how bad the drop-off is as you go downward in educational attainment. What happens as a result of this? Some of the consequences I think are pretty straightforward, and we've talked about them. I want to highlight a couple other consequences that we haven't spent much time on today, and that as I've been looking around, I find more and more important over time. I do want to say one thing, though. It is really hard to say with any confidence that anything that I'm going to talk about is due to technology, is due to unemployment, is due to labor force conditions. Social phenomena almost always have what social scientists call causal density. In other words, anything you look at has lots of factors causing it. There's this rich mix of stuff going on all the time. So any one-to-one argument about robots are causing the following is just way too simplistic. With that caveat, here are some other social phenomena going on that I find interesting, and let me preview them. In general, kind of scary. The first one is mortality. Like a lot of us know, one of the most positive phenomena, and we've talked about it a bit, in any decent recent time period is that mortality, death rates for any demographic group that you care about anywhere around the world have been going down. They've been going down really steadily and quite quickly, with one exception that we just learned about, I believe, last year. Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize, and Susan Case wrote a paper where they documented a counter phenomenon that we were not aware of and that I find kind of scary. It is rising mortality among middle-aged whites in the United States. So those two declining lines are African American mortality and Hispanic mortality. That's that happy phenomenon. They're dying less often. Middle-aged American whites are dying, according to this estimate, the death rate is slowly increasing. Other estimates are quibble with that just a little bit. But Deaton and Case said the difference between those previous downward trends and the flatlining that we're seeing on that line, if you integrate over that area, the loss of life is not trivial. It's about equivalent to the AIDS epidemic. This is a big deal in mortality. Why? It's going on for three reasons. Jeff mentioned the obesity epidemic. And yeah, that's actually a tiny contributor to what's going on. You can look at deaths from diabetes. That's the red line trending up a little bit there. The increase in white mortality is due to three causes: chronic liver disease, suicide, and acute alcohol and drug poisoning. People are killing themselves quickly and slowly. I don't think that's too broad a way to say it, and I can't say it any more politely than that. This is a pretty serious social phenomenon. So we talk about well-being and the fact that you don't need a job to have well-being. This is a pretty scary counterexample. This is the opposite of well-being. In addition, there are there's been some lovely recent work looking at other social conditions and what's been going on. Charles Murray is an interesting guy and a very careful digger in data, and he wrote a book called Coming Apart a little while back, where he characterized these two archetypal American communities, an upper middle class one that he called Belmont, and a lower middle class one that he called Fishtown. And he just looked at a bunch of social trends over a pretty long period of time in these two, and he kind of divided them into these two archetypal communities. So he looked, for example, at what's been happening to divorce rates. And it turns out upper middle class Americans are not getting divorced. Residents of Belmont are not getting divorced any more often than they were 30, 40 years ago. Meanwhile, residents of Fishtown divorce rates are skyrocketing. The number of kids being raised with both biological parents, again, is very high and it's kind of flatlined for decades in Belmont. In Fishtown, that rate is dropping down below 30% in the most recent years. It's a precipitous drop in just 1 or 2 generations. And then finally, both Belmont and Fishtown were white, by the way, because Murray was tired of being called a racist. So he looked at what's been happening to imprisonment rates. No one in this room is not going to prison. Belmont is not going to prison. And crime rates in Fishtown and incarceration rates in Fishtown have been rising in a way that is really, really surprising. And then finally, just in the past couple of years, there have been some really nice work done by sociologists who, even before the rise of Trump, decided to spend some time in these white working class communities. And we can talk about books that came out that I found really informative. One of my favorite ones is a book that just came out early last year called The Politics of Resentment, where a sociologist went around and spent time in these white working class communities in Wisconsin. And she just found this overwhelming sense of grievance and resentment and a feeling of betrayal by this constellation of factors that clearly matter a lot to a lot of people. So I look at some of these social numbers, and I have trouble telling a happy story about them. When I talk to Silicon Valley utopians, I kind of get this idea that what they kind of say is, let's hasten the day when there's no more work, because then it will be all Burning Man all the time. And I don't see that in the communities where work is actually going away over and over again. So I was trying to articulate that this is an actual problem that we need to worry about and this community needs to worry about. I completely agree with Andrew. My number one concern for this weekend is what's been happening with the intersection of technology and jobs and wages. So I was trying to crystallize that, and the best I could come up with earlier this year is something I'm calling McAfee's caution, and it's that if current trends continue, the people are going to rise up before the machines do. This caution has two really powerful virtues. Number one is it fits in a tweet. Number two is that it's got a fantastic visual aid. So that's our incoming president on the left, and that's Nigel Farage, the leader of the Brexit movement in the United Kingdom. Moshe, I agree. We're already seeing symbols of discontent that are altering our political landscape, are going to alter our society for at least the next 4 years. So, second to last question, well, okay, are things going to get any better? Is there any reason to believe that these trends are going to reverse and that we're heading into a happier future? I take a lot of heart from the kind of optimism that Daniela puts out there and that Mark Andreessen articulates when we talk to him. And they're kind of saying, look, there are some problems with this period we're living through, but calm down. People have been talking about mass technological unemployment and all these horrible things that come with automation for 200 years. For 200 years, the economy has grown, the workforce has grown, average incomes has grown, things have gotten massively better. I completely agree with Jeff for a lot of people. We are underestimating that engine of prosperity and meaning out there. 200 years of industrial history are going to repeat themselves, the pattern's going to continue. There's another view that says, no, the thing that we're underestimating, actually, is technological progress, and especially this burst that we're all excited about and that a lot of us are contributing to. The power of modern technology is putting us into a different regime. This time actually is different, and the trends that we've seen here are an early indicator of this different period that we're actually in. And if you believe this, the natural conclusion is that some of these trends are going to continue, and some of them are probably going to accelerate. Personally, I believe that. So finally, what should we do about this? And I'm going to follow Jeff's lead and actually make stuff up out of whole cloth. And what I'm going to make up is a Venn diagram that tries to categorize the solutions that you hear based on the audience that you're interacting with. So the three circles on my Venn diagram are economists, technologists, and politicians, and I want to fill this in a completely idiosyncratic, subjective, and non-scientific way. The first one is that a few politicians like trade wars. Nobody else likes trade wars. I think Trump found the one economist who has a PhD and teaches at a university in the country who thinks a trade war might be a healthy thing for the American economy. Nobody else really believes that. A couple other things that politicians are fond of where you find a bit more commonality with some other constituencies, but only a bit. Jeff did a very nice job of articulating an economist's view of lowering income tax on people and the idea that bounty will happen as a result of that. Some politicians like a minimum wage. A couple economists do, but in general, economists don't like artificial ceilings or floors on prices. They tend to think that perverts the proper working of things. There is some commonality between what economists like. Jeff mentioned a wage subsidy for lower income workers. We have one of those in the United States. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Both Paul Ryan and Obama have said it should be expanded. Most of the economists that we talk to agree pretty strongly with that. In contrast, a lot of technologists that I talk to are, I believe, overexcited about this notion of a basic income. This idea, we are a wealthy society, we can afford to distribute cash to people, let's do that. I agree that we should be helping people earn more money, but when I look at the graphs that Murray put together about the social woes, I honestly struggle to think how any of them would be fixed by dropping money out of helicopters in these communities. It just absolutely does not compute to me. I like work because of the dignity and the value in the community that come along from work. In our last book, Eric and I put a quote from Voltaire in that I continue to fall back on. He said, "Work saves us from three great evils: boredom, vice, and need." Of those three, the universal basic income only takes care of need. I think it's by far the least of the three evils. So where is there some commonality? The economists and technologists that we hang around with are adamant about the need to liberalize immigration, the fact that we're keeping out some of the most talented and tenacious people in the world who want to come here to build their lives and careers. It's Kafkaesque, it's nonsense. And then the idea that we have a couple large companies that are giving working people without advanced skills the opportunity to earn a living by driving a car or by opening up rooms in their homes to rent out to people, and we're putting all kinds of roadblocks in their way. I find that ludicrous. If we're interested in helping people earn a living, we should be interested in companies that help people actually earn a living. And then finally, is there anything in that happy intersection? I'm being a little bit optimistic about this. I think there are a couple things. Trump has talked about infrastructure. We'll see what happens there. but you have to go a long, long way before you find an economist or a technologist that I've talked to who doesn't want better physical and digital infrastructure. And then finally, we've heard over and over and over about the importance of educational reform. I agree with that. I think it's probably necessary. I do not believe for a second that it's sufficient. So I apologize for that quick drink from a fire hose, but I think evidence is always helpful in these discussions. Thanks.